Giuseppe Joe Aiello was a Sicilian bootlegger and organized crime leader in Chicago during the Prohibition era. He was best known for his long and bloody feud with Chicago outfit boss Al Capone. Aiello masterminded several unsuccessful attempts to assassinate Capone and fought against his former business partner Antonio Lombardo, a Capone ally, for control of the Chicago branch of the Union Siciliana Benevolent Society. In November 1925, Lombardo was named head of the Union Siciliana, a Sicilian-American benevolent society that had been corrupted by gangsters. An infuriated Aiello, who had wanted the position himself, believed Capone was responsible for Lombardo's ascension, and he resented the non-Sicilians' attempts to manipulate affairs within the Union. Aiello severed all personal and business ties with Lombardo and entered into a feud with him and Capone, essentially ending a Chicago gang peace treaty that had been in force since the 1926 murder of Capone rival Himmy Weiss. Aiello allied himself with several other Capone enemies, including Dean O'Banion and the trio of Billy Skidmore, Barney Burch, and Jack Suda, who ran vice and gambling houses together. Although they became less receptive to Aiello after Capone personally approached and threatened Skidmore, while newspapers falsely reported that Aiello had also entered into an active alliance with George Bugs Moran and his North Side gang at this time. Moran in fact pledged no specific support to Aiello until later, and instead privately supported Aiello from the sidelines without actively participating. Aiello plotted to eliminate both Lombardo and Capone, and starting in the spring of 1927 made several attempts to assassinate Capone. On one occasion he offered money to the chef of Joseph Esposito's Bella Napoli Cafe, Capone's favorite restaurant, to put prussic acid in Capone's and Lombardo's soup. Reports indicated he offered between $10,000 and $35,000. Instead, the chef exposed the plot to Capone, who responded by dispatching men to destroy one of Aiello's stores on West Division Street with machine gun fire. More than 200 bullets were fired into the Aiello brothers' bakery on May 28, 1927, wounding Joe's brother Antonio. During the summer and autumn of 1927, a number of hitmen Aiello hired to kill Capone were themselves slain. Among them were Anthony Russo and Vincent Spicuzza, each of whom had been offered $25,000 by Aiello to kill Capone and Lombardo. Aiello eventually offered a $50,000 reward to anyone who eliminated Capone. At least 10 gunmen tried to collect on Aiello's bounty, but ended up dead. Capone ally Ralph Sheldon attempted to kill both Capone and Lombardo for Aiello's reward, but Capone henchman Frank Nitty's intelligence network learned of the transaction and had Sheldon shot in front of a West Side hotel, although he didn't die. In November 1927, Aiello organized machine gun ambushes across from Lombardo's home and a cigar store frequented by Capone, but those plans were foiled after an anonymous tip led police to raid several addresses and arrest Milwaukee gunman Angelo LaManchio and 4 other Aiello gunmen. After the police discovered receipts for the apartments in LaManchio's pockets, he confessed that Aiello had hired him to kill Capone and Lombardo, leading the police to arrest Aiello himself and bring him to the South Clark Street police station. Upon learning of the arrest, Capone dispatched nearly 24 gunmen to stand guard outside the station and await Aiello's release. The men made no attempt to conceal their purpose there, and reporters and photographers rushed to the scene to observe Aiello's expected murder. Capone gunmen Frank Perry, Sam Marcus and Louis Campagna were arrested as they tried to enter the front of the station and placed in the cell next to Aiello, who Campagna told, "You're dead, friend, dead. You won't get up to the end of the street still walking." Aiello pleaded for mercy and promised to sell his possessions and leave Chicago with his family if they let him go, but Campagna refused the request. When released, Aiello was given a police escort out of the station to safety. He later failed to make a court appearance after his attorney claimed he suffered a nervous breakdown. Aiello disappeared with some family members to Trenton, New Jersey, from whence he continued his campaign against Capone and Lombardo. Aiello's brother Dominic returned to Chicago in January 1928 to attend to family matters while his brother remained in New Jersey. One day he received a telephone call warning him to leave town, after which the Aiello brothers' bakery was shot up by gunmen. Aiello briefly allied himself with former Capone employer and friend Frankie Yale, meeting with him regularly in New York City and plotting Capone's overthrow. until Aiello himself was murdered. Aiello was said to have fled to Wisconsin under the protection of the Milwaukee crime family, and also briefly took refuge in Buffalo with his ally there, crime family boss Stefano Magaddino. With Aiello still in hiding, Capone started targeting Aiello's men and killed several over the next few years, including his brother Dominic. Aiello returned to Chicago in the summer of 1928 and once again approached Moran, whose relationship with Capone had degenerated even further, making him much more receptive to an active alliance with Aiello. They conspired to eliminate Lombardo, a task they assigned to hitmen Frank Tightlips and Peter Gussenberg. Lombardo was shot to death on a busy Chicago street on September 7, 1928, and although never arrested, at least one of the Gussenberg brothers is believed to have been among the shooters. After Lombardo's death, Aiello attempted to elevate his ally Peter Rizzuto to the Union Siciliana position, but Rizzuto was killed by shotgun blasts outside his home. Aiello was also believed to have masterminded the murder of Pasqualino Patsy Lolordo, Lombardo's successor as head of the Union, who was killed in his home on January 8, 1929. Police alleged that Aiello suggested a truce with Lolordo, and when Lolordo invited Aiello into his home for a toast of friendship, Aiello and two others shot him to death. When police later questioned Lolordo's widow, she screamed when she was shown a photo of Aiello, but refused to explain why she was afraid and would not answer questions about him. Capone retaliated against Moran by organizing the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a hit that wiped out the Gussenberg brothers, decimated Moran's forces and resulted in the loss of a significant amount of Aiello's support. Shortly afterwards, Aiello persuaded Capone killers Albert Anselmi and John Scalise to betray their employer and convinced Joseph Hopto Junta, the new head of the Union Siciliana, to support Aiello in eliminating Capone and taking control of the north side of Chicago following the departure of Bugs Moran. However, Capone learned of Aiello's plot in April 1929 and killed all three men. The violent retaliation against Aiello indirectly led him to finally become head of the Union. During a conference in Atlantic City, numerous mob bosses supported Aiello's promotion with the hopes of restoring order in Chicago, and Capone apparently accepted the decision, at least temporarily. Retired Chicago mob boss Johnny Torrio was said to have mediated a peace agreement among Capone, Aiello, and Moran, in which they agreed to end the gang warfare and murders. However, Aiello's accession coincided with Capone serving a year in prison for carrying a concealed weapon, which Aiello saw as an opportunity to take control of some of Capone's territory and scheme yet again for his assassination. Aiello gained a measure of nationwide notoriety around this time, after ranking 7th on Chicago Crime Commission Chairman Frank J. Loescha's Public Enemies list, released in April 1930, which identified the top 28 people he saw as corrupting Chicago. Through his mafia boss allies Magaddino and Gaspar Milazzo, Aiello arranged a meeting with Joe Masuria, seeking support in Aiello's efforts against Capone. During the meeting, Masuria offered to support Aiello in exchange for control of the east side of Chicago. Which would allow Aiello to keep the city's west side. The offer infuriated Aiello, who threatened Masuria and ordered him to leave the city. In turn, Masuria spread false rumors that Aiello attempted to kill Masuria, giving him a pretext to support Capone in retaliation. Mafioso Joseph Bonanno later described as a key incident in starting the Castellamarese War in New York City. Masuria openly supported Capone, requiring a strong alliance with him following the death of Masuria ally Giuseppe Morello. He also offered territory to Milazzo if he betrayed Aiello, an offer Milazzo rebuffed and considered insulting. As a result, Aiello backed Salvatore Maranzano in the Castellamarese War, providing the Maranzano forces with $5,000 a week for their war chest. During the early months of 1930, Aiello arranged several unsuccessful assassination attempts against Capone bodyguards, including Jack McGurn, Phil D'Andrea, and Rocco DeGrazia. Aiello hoped to leave Capone vulnerable by depleting his security, and Capone began to suspect Aiello had spies within the Chicago outfit because he seemed to have inside knowledge about where his targets would be and when. In August 1930, 2 months before Aiello's death, the state's attorney conducted a raid on Aiello's home, obtaining records as part of a series of raids by the United States government to fight against gangland activities in Chicago. In 1930, upon learning of Aiello's continued plotting against him, Capone resolved to finally eliminate him. In the weeks before Aiello's death, Capone's men tracked him to Rochester, New York, where he had connections through Megadino, and plotted to kill him there, but Aiello returned to Chicago before the plot could be executed. Angst-ridden from the constant need to hide out and the killings of several of his men, set up residence in the Chicago apartment of Union Siciliana treasurer Pasquale Prestigiacomo. He moved in on October 13, 1930, and rarely left the apartment. However, his wife and child occasionally visited him, and Frank Nitti biographer Marzagigian Jr. theorized that Capone's forces located Aiello by tracking his family members. Men who gave the names Morris Friend and Henry Jacobson rented rooms in an apartment across the street overlooking Prestigiacomo's apartment building and began observing Aiello. On October 23, Aiello made plans to permanently leave Chicago and apparently move to Mexico, although Prestigiacomo later told police Aiello was simply leaving the house for a barber's appointment. Upon exiting Prestigiacomo's building to enter a taxi cab, a gunman in a second-floor window across the street started firing at Aiello with a submachine gun. Aiello was said to have been shot at least 13 times before he toppled off the building steps and moved around the corner, attempting to move out of the line of fire. Instead, he moved directly into the range of a second submachine gun positioned on the third floor of another apartment block and was subsequently gunned down. After the ambush, the two apparent shooters ran from the buildings and fled in a Ford sedan. The car was later discovered to have been set on fire and destroyed. Aiello's body was loaded into the taxi cab and taken to Garfield Park Hospital, where he was pronounced dead. The coroner eventually removed 59 bullets, weighing over a pound, from the body. He was shot more times than any single victim of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. A third machine gun position, which was ultimately not used, was later discovered by police in another nearby building, which had been rented a week before the murder by a man who gave the name Lon Gillespie. Prosecutors and federal agents immediately and publicly speculated that Capone was behind the assassination, noting that the precision machine gun ambush was typical of his attacks. However, at least one press story at the time speculated Moran could have been behind the hit. Prestigiacomo, fearful for his life, went into hiding for 3 days after Aiello's death before turning himself into police. He was charged as an accessory before the fact of Aiello's murder, a charge also filed against John Source, an employee of Aiello's importing company. Detectives questioned whether Prestigiacomo provided Aiello's enemies with information about his whereabouts, something he vehemently denied. Police claimed Prestigiacomo was not cooperative and lied about his relationship with Aiello. The charges against Prestigiacomo went to a grand jury, but were ultimately dropped. Frank Nitti was also wanted by police for questioning in connection with the murder. Capone continued to hunt down Aiello's allies even after his death. 1 month after Aiello was killed, police discovered an abandoned machine gun nest, manned by alleged Capone gangsters, in a house opposite the home of 4 of Aiello's former henchmen. Aiello's death left Capone effectively unchallenged in his control over Chicago, and brought 70 years of peace to the city in terms of the Chicago outfit leadership. Aiello was believed to have been responsible for the deaths of at least 24 people throughout his life, according to the Chicago Tribune, which described him as the toughest gangster in Chicago, and one of the toughest in the country.